Every day I wake up in Britain.
Hello, darkness, my old friend.
Yeah, it's not the best place in the world to be. It's also not the worst place, but something has been clear to me for a while. This country, the state that governs it, even a significant amount of the people and the institutions that are supposed to do basically anything, have some kind of rot in them. I'm not a pessimist by nature, and I like to solve problems. So how exactly are you meant to solve Britain? How do I make a place I call Piss Island work? Well, what if it didn't have to be Britain at all? What if the problem is so deeply embedded that it'd be better to just start all over again? Just completely wipe the slate clean and start all over again. Either through balkanizing the UK or through some kind of weird 80s movie style time machine that sends me back to Alfred the Great to stop him from being the Great. In all seriousness though, I've been thinking about my relationship to Britain and the British identity because it's not my only identity. And when you have other options, suddenly Britain and Britishness, even if they don't have the drawback of your other identities, at least as you see them, seems like a load of bullshit we're telling ourselves to feel better. In this video, I'm going to do something a bit different. I've managed to collect some people who are willing to chat for a little while about this. It gave me a lot to think about. And I'll include some clips of them as well for you all as we go through. By the end of the video, I should have told you the story of the UK and its inevitable decay, tried to work out what Britishness actually is, and managed to make the case for abolition. So with all of that in mind, let's get started.
The UK, a story of decay.
Right, where to begin with this? The UK is shit. It's shit. That's just the only word you can use to describe it. It's fucking shit. And I don't mean in that teenage, I want to leave my hometown way. I mean it's actually impressive how shit the country is. Not just at the statistical level when compared to similar countries, just in essence of how miserable people clearly are. Think about this. If everything you ever wanted politically was catered to, you'd probably at least be able to be happy about it for a little while, right? You know, even if it didn't reach your expectations, you might be able to get some joy from it. Well, I have to live in a country where people are screaming after every single little occasion that, oh, it can always be worse. It could have always been worse, you know, and I really, really do not give a fuck if it could be worse. It's shit now. The shit things are happening now. Why do I have to give a shit if it could be worse? It's still fucking shit, for fuck's sake. And do any of these people want to do anything about this country being fucking shit? No, of course not, because it being shit is what they wanted. Just god fucking damn these people, honestly. Anyway, that I think I am not far into this recording and I am already quite pissed off. So, let's see how we go through this one. We had to get here somehow, right? A country like Britain, with all its wealth and legitimately acquired museum artifacts and delightful cuisine and statues of slavers, it doesn't just form in a vacuum, does it? So how did we get from this to this? It's kind of a long story, and as interesting as it is, I'm going to skip over a lot of it because, you know, this is a YouTube video and I can only keep your attention for so long. But what we are going to do is hit the highlights that are relevant for our particular purpose. So, sorry to the aforementioned Alfred the Great, you have to be great on someone else's video. Though, something he created is very relevant to all of this. You know it, you love it, England. If there's an original sin in the UK, it's probably England. And when you look at a map of the UK and how much of it is England, it kind of makes sense that the majority of the things we're talking about here are heavily influenced by the historic actions of England and the desires of a particular class of people in England who somehow still rule over us today. But my feelings on that are a story for another day. So, the Kingdom of England was already quite a diverse place. A lot of languages were spoken within it, and once it incorporated Wales into itself as a principality in 1216 by, a series of wars under a process begun by William the Conqueror, though to be clear, he's still a bastard in all ways, and more or less wrapped up in a meaningful way by the Plantagenets. Yeah, there was about a third of Wales outside of England's control, but by then, without significant outside help, their fate had sadly been sealed, and they became English. So, F's to pay respects, everyone, in the replies. Of course, I'm just kidding. I would never condemn anyone to the natural fate of the English, which is very clear in law.
These days, if you say you're English, you get arrested and thrown in jail.
So what was the point of that little bit of history? Was it just me showing off a little? Yes, it always is. But the point is to demonstrate something about the modern UK today. That England is a big part of it. And I don't just mean by geographic area or because we all speak English, though that's inevitably a part of it. I mean, it's just dominant in all ways. It has the largest population, the largest economy. Most of our ruling class either come from England or integrate so well into the style of the English ruling class that you can barely tell the fucking difference. I can never replicate the face that I made when I realised my Uncle Gove was Scottish, for example. I just assumed he was a really weird, weaselly English person, but no, Scottish apparently. Unbelievable, still, refuse to believe it. The process of gradual conquest and integration into the governing structure was also followed with Ireland, with once again the Plantagenets instigating it, with this lovely sounding entity called the Lordship of Ireland, which imposed a Norman ruling class over varying amounts of Ireland over time, but let's just say it was always a lot of it. Then it became the Kingdom of Ireland in a personal union with England, which in reality means the governing structure of Ireland was a client state to England and then to the UK when that formed. The UK's actual formation is kind of interesting because it came about in one of the funniest attempts at imperialism in history. And it's funny because the colonisers ate shit, which is the only way it can ever be funny. Imagine a Scottish person. Now, I love my Scottish friends, but if we're being totally honest about it, how many of them do you think are cut out for building a 17th century colony in the Panama Isthmus? I don't think it's likely. I don't think it's many of them. Sure, today, if you try to do it, you'll have your bottled water and factor 420 sunscreen and some shots, medical shots, but the other kind depending on whether you partake in that or not. But imagine having to not only go there, but settle that land in 1698. You might imagine it would go poorly, and to cut a long story short, it did, to the tune of about a quarter of Scotland's national wealth at the time. Entire fortunes of the ruling class were squandered on this venture, which made the Act of Union seem like quite a good way to settle the debt. This is the thing. When you're all over multiple kingdoms, yeah, you get a lot of prestige and look like you're very competent and powerful, but the assets and liabilities of your kingdoms, they're separate, because a lot of the time there are different political structures in each one. Different powerful stakeholders, even different geopolitical interests between your multiple kingdoms. I mean, think about how different the interests of Austria and Spain were, but they were in a personal union under the Habsburgs. The point is, you can't just move money from Spain to Austria. I mean, you can in a literal sense, but Spanish nobles might get mad at you if you don't give them a piece of the action, or sweet talk them, or marry one of their weird sons to your daughter. And you only have so much money, charisma, and daughters to go around, so someone somewhere is going to get mad, and they might choose to depose you. England and Scotland aren't Austria and Spain, though. I mean, to state the really obvious, I guess. For one, England and Scotland had been in a personal union for around 100 years, and they neighbour each other. Good signs for unifying your crowns. When one of your crowns bankrupts themselves on a stupid colonial venture, well, There's your opportunity. A big, wealthy, powerful England can bail out Scotland, but you have to be one crown, with one ruler, with one political structure. So that's how the UK is born. And to fast forward quite a bit, here's a map of the British Empire at its peak, and a general comment from me that people don't just welcome oppressors, and the maintaining of this empire took a lot of atrocities, including some that are in living memory. And this seems to me to be the foundational element of the British identity as it's expressed. British people, when asked, don't seem to think the British Empire is something to be ashamed of. And while they're not alone in not feeling ashamed among former imperial powers, it is interesting to note that British people are more likely to believe their former colonies are better off now because of empire than worse off. Which is wrong, and a failure on so many levels. It's also impossible to separate this feeling about empire from the country's wider attitude to both world wars, but in particular the second one. British people have come to the conclusion that Britain primarily contributed to the victory of the Allies, as opposed to, the country that did the largest portion of the heavy lifting, sacrifice of human life, and actual damage to the Nazi war machine. I don't know. It's really interesting, that's all. When you feel like your country is the one that defeated fascism, then it can be easy to get caught up in moralizing about how great the country is, and that's something the British love to do. And while this video is a lot of criticism of Britain and Britishness, I don't know, maybe it can be pleasant sometimes, but that doesn't mean it's perfect or even good. The legacy of imperialism hasn't really been confronted, particularly in English circles and by the British state itself. In fact, we're still sending off royals to Caribbean islands. Why are we doing this? Who is it for? At least they got the reception they deserved, and Jamaica is now becoming a republic. We sure could use some of that ourselves, I reckon. A lot of people, especially on the left, if you ask them to point to a time when the UK was, if not good, then at least seemed to do some of the things domestically that helped some people, it would be the post-war consensus, particularly the 1945-51 Labour government and the 1964-70 Labour government. A lot of this feeling of the UK as a country in decline for me, and for possibly a lot of other people, is by making this comparison between where we are now and what happened from 1945 to about the mid-70s. And it's easy to see why you might feel that way, because once neoliberalism wasn't just sort of brought in and implemented by Thatcher, but accepted by Labour both before and after she came to power, in fact, it wasn't just the case that the state wouldn't provide the things that, say, a social democrat or a centrist might feel it ought to provide, even if the people who hold those positions will regularly argue against those positions or convince people to vote for ideological right-wingers as the lesser evil, which is a thing I've spoken about at length in another video. It's that there was no expectation that the state could provide anything, which goes some way to explain the sheer joy, or at least a sense of relief the UK felt when furlough came in during the COVID-19 pandemic, even though the policy was inadequate, because of course it had to be. And the UK went on to kind of prove that it may well be incapable of doing anything other than gimmicks with things like Eat Out to Help Out, which, you really need to have someone under 40 in the room consulting on these things to avoid names like that. The thing about a decline, whether it's perceived or real, in this case I think it's both, because there is a decline, but people are misidentifying it by putting the post-war consensus on a pedestal uncritically, is that people don't tend to like it very much. It causes strife, which can be exploited by cynical political actors, which isn't helped by a whole lot of things that people can easily point to about the British political system. Unrepresentative parties tend to have a monopoly on power, whether they're red or blue Tories. We have an unelected upper chamber filled with lords who are supposed to provide expertise into scrutinised legislation, but really are an undemocratic farce filled with the cronies of various political parties who get to put people in it. This has led to one of the more frustrating things about the UK for a lot of people, that public opinion has almost zero bearing on policy. This isn't the video to go into it, but if you were to ask the British public what it is exactly that they want, it's not this, or anything like this. And it's not really anything that the governments we tend to get do. Which makes you wonder whether the British people are lying about what they want, plain stupid, or whether there's a lot of other complicated intersecting interests going on. But that feels like a story for another day. Then we have entire regions of the UK who, to put it bluntly, don't tend to get the government they want, and can't really force the political calculus in electoral politics to make that the case. Take Scotland, for example. At the 2019 general election, if every single Scottish seat had voted Labour, I know, but just bear with me here, we would still have a Tory government. And it's not a coincidence that movements who want to leave the UK make a point about the UK government very rarely or never being the one that the people of their respective countries and regions voted for. That's frustrating, especially when, as we'll see in the next section, there's a sense from people that this country simply doesn't work and isn't really on a realistic trajectory towards working. But we'll get to that as we try and answer what exactly Britishness is.
What is Britishness?
What is Britishness? This is a big question, right? But the good news is, because people can't ever shut the fuck up and the government can't stop doing insanely evil shit, we have a lot of people offering their thoughts on what exactly Britishness is. I'm going to try and keep a straight face for a lot of this and try to divine exactly what it is people who really believe in a positive British identity think. I will probably be pointing at the shit they say and pointing out why it's nonsense, but it's only fair to have some friends of mine read out some really cursed British thoughts. Now, I actually quite like the author of the book we're about to have some quotes from, but this quote and the ones that will follow it are such a good example of how the British view themselves and the contradictions in that, I can't really resist sharing it. So here's an example of how Peter Oborne, the author of this particular book that I got this excerpt from, thinks the country has been viewed historically and what they think has gone wrong.
It's not long since Britain was famed for both public and private probity. Liars were shunned in private and public life. Under Boris Johnson, political deceit has become not just commonplace but automatic. His election as Prime Minister suggests that British people no longer care about the difference between fact and fiction or truth and falsehood. What kind of a society have we become?
And this is fascinating because it's not like Britain would ever elect and then re-elect a known liar surrounded by known liars. In fact, the author makes this very good point, though it's not the good point that he thinks it is, in the very next paragraph.
It's unimaginable that a compulsive liar such as Johnson could have been chosen to lead the Conservative Party in a previous era, let alone be elected Prime Minister. There was a time before the emergence of political parties as we know them today when it was normal for ministers to lie, cheat and bribe.
Which makes me think, why would we expect Britain to be so very different from that today? The fact is that it's been normal for a very long time for these things to happen in Britain. So while the self-image of Britain seems to be that they were famed for public and private probity, which I shouldn't really laugh when I have to read that, I'm sorry. In fact, in this book, he falls into some of the very things I spoke about in the last section about how World War II takes up a significant place in the construction of Britishness.
In the 1940s, Churchill and Franklin D. Roosevelt led the free world against fascist dictatorship. Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher fought a common battle against Soviet tyranny. 2 decades later, Bill Clinton's New Democrats and Tony Blair's New Labour rebranded the left to create a softer capitalism on each side of the Atlantic.
Without going too far into each one, I'll summarise World War II with a bit of simple editing here. We'll just have a little bit of a, yeah, that's probably good. Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher weren't just supporters of autocracy abroad, but also at home. To suggest that they were fighting tyranny while supporting cunts like Pinochet and death squads in Latin America is, an accidentally accurate assessment of the British self-image, which seems to want to do horrible shit, then be praised for it. And the idea that capitalism was softened by either Bill Clinton or Tony Blair, it just doesn't stand up to scrutiny, really, does it? Because let's be honest, they only consolidated the worst of their predecessors' policies without leaving a discernible positive legacy. There are other things that often crop up about Britishness, though, particularly when the British government does something like its recent move to essentially outsource its asylum responsibilities to Rwanda, which, you know, is basically a policy straight out of the 1970s National Front. And to be fair to people, they're not stupid, they know that's the case, but some of the reactions to it are a bit much for me to take seriously.
I used to be proud of things my country did. Our moderation, our kindness, our judgment, our influence, which in my lifetime was mostly, though not always, for the best. The clear sense we were heading into a more enlightened future. All that is over, and it's heartbreaking.
Okay. When was it any of these things? The UK has never ever held to any of these things. That being said, it's very common for people to genuinely believe this about Britain. Whenever any of these kinds of things happen, and if you've watched my Lesser Evil video, you know Britain does this shit really often under both Labour and Tory governments. People come out with bullshit like this.
It's certainly true that it's quite likely to be illegal, that it will certainly be incredibly expensive, and that it probably won't work. But worse than all this is that the Rwanda plan is shaming. Britain is better than this.
Okay. I need people to understand this. Britain isn't better than anything. People really seem to believe this about Britain. And it does form part of the overarching British identity. Then people will connect it to a political era that they prefer, such as this from a particularly liberal dipshit. I don't even know anymore. Just cut to the fucking clip.
Say what you like about the New Labour Britain era and the things they got wrong, but Britain wasn't globally embarrassing, wasn't without serious international trading power, wasn't culturally shit, and wasn't corrupt.
Okay, I just can't. I can't with these people anymore. Let's move the fuck on before I say something I regret. Let's hit the next section. Let's go. Okay, so this next part's going to be a bit different, you know. It's going to be quite personal about myself, which I'm not necessarily 100% comfortable about. But the way I've experienced Britain and Britishness might be helpful, because I've interviewed people from Scotland, Wales, and the north of England for this, and they brought their own perspectives that were interesting and unique. I also have a different perspective on Britishness and the way it was formed. And the way that perspective was formed was quite personal and through personal experience. So there's going to be a timestamp for you to skip it. I won't be offended if you skip it. How would I know who skips it and who doesn't skip it? But if you do skip around, you'll be learning a little bit about me, maybe a bit more about me than I ever wanted people to learn, but I think it might be important. So I was born in Reading in 1994, which is already quite a bleak opening when you think about all that implies. But I am from Britain, in the sense that I was born here, and a lot of the things I'm going to talk about, I actually wrote in a thing I published a while ago, which has long since been deleted. I deleted all traces of it, even the version of it that was on my laptop, and I deleted it because I felt overwhelmed by a feeling of embarrassment for being what I felt was too earnest about me, and how vulnerable I felt in my position in the UK. That's the thing that's hard for people, white British people specifically, to understand. which is that there's an inherent insecurity when you're any kind of minority, really, in this country. But a second-generation migrant, which is what I am, my parents were born in Turkey, they moved here in 1985, that has challenges of their own, of its own within that. And I suppose this section is part trying to inform you all, give you a perspective, but also part me telling this past self who was ashamed of this earnestness and honesty and sort of talking about things that are not easy to talk about, to go fuck himself, the dickhead. So my relationship to Britishness is inevitably related to an element of Englishness. And no, I didn't say the forbidden phrase. You know the one. Don't make me play the clip again. So no jail for me. England and Britain, to me, are connected at the hip. I've had one foot in and one foot out of them for most of my life growing up. Like, take this, for example. The language that was spoken in my home was mostly Turkish. I spoke Galatasaray. Don't look up their league position at the moment, please. And I also supported my hometown team, Reading. Also, don't look up their position in the league either. It's really not been a big season for either team. One particular political moment sort of sticks out to me about Britishness. When I was about 13, 14, my parents sat me down and did something that really should have told me something was up. They talked to me seriously. And this was at a time when there were fears, this is 2007, 2008. There are fears that the BNP is gaining significant electoral traction. Now, that's not necessarily the point or the thing to be afraid of with far-right political parties, but anyway, they decided to show me where all of these documents are, right? And I'm just like, what the fuck are you showing me these for? And they're like, well, no, these are important documents. You gotta know where they are, because what if the bad thing happens and you have to get the fuck out of the country? I'm not a dual national. I was never a dual national. I was always a British citizen. I was always a single national. And I held no other citizenship other than the British one. And looking back on it, I felt in that moment maybe like that wasn't the smartest idea. Like maybe I needed a backup plan. Now, the BNP have been and gone electorally, even if their policies are now mainstream in the UK, which leads me to think about the British state and Britishness. Are things like the BNP and the integration of their policies into the mainstream, is this a feature or is it a bug? Because if it's a bug, it's easy for us to say, well, here's how we fix Britain and Britishness. And presumably keep all that lovely stuff that, I think about and you probably think about that's positive about Britain, in that weird, sort of desperate, clinging way that some people seem to think about it. The thing about that is, so I cast my mind back to 2019, particularly during that election campaign. Now, that was tough. I was out every day I could spare, the weather was horrible, it was cold, met a lot of nice people, met some very unfriendly people too, would you believe. And one of the things that stood out to me was the way various minorities were used as political footballs. And seeing that conjured up these feelings I hadn't had since essentially that conversation with my parents. That insecurity suddenly comes roaring back into your life. And I felt it a little bit, there's no secret about the fact that Turkey, people loved to talk shit about Turkey in 2016 in that EU referendum. People did love talking shit about it. But they just did. They did love talking shit about it. And it hadn't quite registered to me at that time what it was, quite what was going on with that. I felt uncomfortable, like a spotlight was being shined on me, but I didn't feel that particularly intense and terrifying insecurity. That's about the long and short of it. This country has the capacity to scare someone like me, who's lived here their whole life. And the worst part of it is there is a Britishness, a part of Britishness that I like and identify with. But it's the things that everyone says when they're pushed to identify something nice about the country. You know, your friends, your family. The landscape can be pleasant, you know. It's not the abstracted ideal of Britain, because how can you love an idea that will never love you back? And I know it won't. I don't want to hear, oh, but Britain can be like this or that in the comments. Sure, it can be. Do you see a feasible way for it to be like that? I could end up being the most famous YouTuber in the world. It's not especially feasible. It could happen if you like and subscribe. Sorry, Dad. Oh, that didn't come out right at all. But you see what the issue is, right? Britain is the Britain I experienced in 2007 and 2008 with the rise of the BNP. It is the country where minorities are mercilessly used as political footballs. It's also a country that isn't better than outsourcing its asylum system to Rwanda, just to satisfy a handful of home counties' racists and some largely imaginary northern boomer. I don't enjoy that it's the case, because I do feel something positive towards this country. Not in a stupid, at least I think it's stupid, progressive patriotism way. Because I'm patriotic about, you know, my friends and my family and, you know, the things that I can do here. Not the Union flag or World War II or British values or, you know, the abstract Britain that exists largely in the minds of people in the home counties and in the upper class. Because there aren't any uniquely British values. And any values that people come up with are totally made up, because the reality of this country is completely different to the imagined ideal. That's the thing people are not grasping, strictly speaking. There is something poisoned in the very essence of this country, and it's hard to get away from. And once you see it, you kind of can't stop seeing it in everything. Okay, with that done and out of the way, let's do something a bit different with my videos. I actually found some people who wanted their respective countries or regions to leave the UK. So this is going to be a bit of a rough cut, bit of a rough edit, because it's the first time doing this. Sometimes the audio isn't captured well because, you know, we have technical difficulties. But what I was looking for was, in essence, trying to figure out what we could understand about Britishness and the British state from what our interviewees felt their identities represented and could provide, you know, if they became independent, that the British one couldn't. So let's get to those interviews. First, though, you know, again, remember, rough edit, rough cut, but let's see how much fun we can have. But before we get into the actual interviews, something did come up an awful lot during them, and I think it's important that we have a little a compilation. We have a little fun in this video. Let's go to the compilation.
England.
The English.
In England.
England. English.
English. England.
In England.
England.
English.
Compilation. Okay, that last one was a bit out of character, but that's the thing that was interesting. Even though it was only 3 people who I spoke to, because, you know, I only have so much time in the day and you can't just talk to everyone. There were a lot of different perspectives brought and a lot of interesting things said. So I'll let them actually introduce themselves to you. So we'll cut to their intros. Would you like to introduce yourself and what your identity is and all of these other things that we're talking about tonight?
Yep, sure. My name's Dave Heaven. I am the deputy leader of the Northern Independence Party. It's a new movement set up very recently, along the lines of Plaid Cymru and the SNP, that wishes to seek independence for the north of England, essentially from Westminster. I'm a proud Yorkshireman and a father of 2.
First of all, I wanted you to introduce yourself and which particular independence movement it is you support.
Hi, my name's Elijah. I'm a musician up in Aberdeen. I to Scotland around 11 years ago now, maybe 12. thereabouts, and I became active in sort of local politics pretty quickly. And since I've arrived here, I've been part of the independence movement as an SNP party member, as a Scottish Socialist Party member, as a non-party member, as just sort of going along to various campaigns, whether that was RIC, the Radical Independence campaign, or doing stuff with Common Space, which unfortunately has taken a bit of a melty turn lately.
Yeah, so my name is Dan. I'm from South Wales. I live in Cardiff. I am a long-standing trade unionist, sort of grown up on the left, always, I guess like a lifetime on the left. As long as I can remember, I've been a strong supporter of Welsh Independence. I've been involved in sort of various Welsh Independence sort of blitz or bins or whatever. I'm not actually involved in anything at the moment. I run a podcast called Desolation Radio, which is basically like a Marxist podcast, which was originally sort of mainly just on Wales, but we sort of got bored of that now, so we're sort of branching out. But
and I wanted to nail down exactly what they felt that their preferred identity was, where they felt it came from, and whether it differed. Well, it did differ, but how much it differed and how it differed from the dominant British identity in this country. And I got some interesting thoughts from them all.
I can tell you what it is to be a northerner. I can tell you what it's like to have to rely on all the people around you when Westminster decides to destroy communities around. I can tell you what it's like to walk the Yorkshire Dales and the Lake District. And that's a range across the north. The city of Liverpool, I mean, I'm from Yorkshire, but the city of Liverpool banded together when it was treated in such an appalling manner. Manchester banded together after the horrific incident at Manchester Arena. And that, I think, is what northernness is. That when things go wrong, we get together. We don't seek to blame. We just seek to look after each other. Now, I felt that coincidentally, my dad is Welsh, and I have actually felt this in Wales.
Then I guess you could look at the differences. Then if you look at some of the things the English lads would say casually, or some of the not all obviously, but there is possibly a more chauvinistic aspect of some of the English lads' behaviour. But I guess what I'm saying is, like, culturally, I have no problem accepting a common identity and interest with with Britishness at all. I think the main difference is I just don't like the British state. For me, that's all really. Everything is about socialism. I think the best route to socialism is through breaking up the British state and through Welsh independence. I think it's an innate good to break up the British state because it's a militarist, imperialist state. And so I think it's just that I think that's the big difference, is that I don't have any political affiliation with Britishness and the institutions of Britishness.
As for the difference into like how I find myself, I have been thinking about this a little bit. I don't really know why I feel Scottish from like an origin point, right? Like there was no decision, there was no like sort of fundamental cause. It's just something that happened because I was in an area where being that way and feeling that way was what people did and was what I did, and the sort of larger force of community just kind of made that happen in a way. And I think one of the differences that I found, and it's why I and other people that I've met, I mean, you've definitely come across people reacting a bit defensively to being told that they're actually British.
Right.
As opposed to Irish, Northern Irish, Scottish, Welsh, whatever, right? And I think that is, again, it's like it's a self-replicating phenomenon. A national identity that just like allows you to be it with the option of not being it, like if you know whatever, is just going to be a lot more natural and easy to kind of merge into, and a lot more appealing than an identity that tries to sort of proselytize at you, right? It's almost evangelical, because there's a political need, there's a material power-based need for British identity to be a thing.
And with Elijah's identity, I found something interesting, which was who he said seemed to particularly care about him calling himself Scottish.
On a personal level, it felt like there was a very specific kind of person who cared a lot about whether I was British or Scottish. And that kind of person was not the kind of person that I wanted to give any satisfaction to.
Could you describe the type of person for us, just because I think that might be interesting?
Generally, English, right wing, and the occasional Queen obsessed sort of Rangers fan. The only people who've ever had a problem with me being Scottish or saying I'm Scottish that I've ever met in my entire life have like 90% been English people with like right-wing views.
The fact that typically English people and right-wingers really seemed to care whether he identified as Scottish really interested me, and linked up with a point he actually made a bit later in our conversation.
British identity is absolutely, I think that is a weapon of state power. That is a way to exert cultural power and political power in the UK. Whether it's as like a veil, you know, like a veneer, like a sheen, like a mask. Like no, we're inclusive. It's fine. Like all the racism stuff, that's just English people being like super English. But really, we're British, and Britain is big and international and inclusive. Everyone loved the Beatles and the Union Jacks and the backpacks in America. You know, all this kind of stuff, right? But I mean, if you live in it, I think if you even just take like the most superficial of all sort of analyses of what that actually represents, it's just an extension of Englishness, really. Just the way that, yeah.
That was what I was going to sort of ask, was, is Britishness simply an extension of Englishness?
I think generally, absolutely. I'm sure there's people in various parts of England who have very, very determined and very noticeable and very livable and identifiable more regional cultural expressions that are not uniform across what is England.
And that point about it being an extension of Englishness, which is probably a result of it being the largest constituent country, is important and borne out by the history of the country I laid out earlier, which has probably led to what Dave described about Englishness here. One thing we do have to address is kind of the big elephant in the room when it comes to the UK and Britain generally, which is England, and whether England has a particular role or characteristic that shapes this state in a particular way to behave in the way it does. I was just wondering if you thought there was anything particular to England, because it is the largest constituent country. You know, it has this outsized influence, because it has London in it. It has this outsized influence on the general politics of the country. Whether you felt, because you're the one person I'm speaking to who lives in England for now, whether you felt England itself or an English identity itself had some contributing elements to this general negativity around the British identity that you, or this lack of British identity that you just can't see.
Honestly, unfortunately, I think it does. The way that England has behaved over the last 300 years, 400 years, I can't defend that. I just can't. England has been the the main motivator of the British Empire, and I can't defend the way that it conducted itself from Africa to East India, and in modern times there seems to be England itself has lost its character into Britishness, and then I don't know what Britishness is.
And I also think it's important to remember this idea that Englishness or Britishness is a tool of state power, particularly being imposed on the periphery. I think that's important and interesting, and it definitely relates to why there might be a desire to push back against it, especially if things are very fucking shit, which they are. The character of this Englishness as it relates to Britishness is interesting too. I tried to tease that out of the interviewees, and Dan made this point about there being a strain of reactionary nationalism in England that's more of a threat there than in Wales or Scotland.
Obviously, there is a strain of that, like, you know, there is a strain. It would be stupid to deny the reality that there is a probably rising strain of reactionary nationalism in England, which is far stronger, and I'd say more dangerous than it is in Wales and Scotland, despite all the fear mongering about, like, you know, nationalists. And it's like, ooh, these nationalists are so scary, you know, like they're all anti-nuclear pacifists, you know. That's in Wales, like, that's really, it's just because they speak Welsh, you know, like the people freak out about it. But I do think that, you know, there is a chauvinist element in England, which is obviously a bit larger than it is, and you know, and so England do need, you know, people in England do need to do the same work as everyone else in terms of, like, you know, discussing the role of empire and, you know, the ongoing role of militarism. These things have massively corrosive effects on, like, the political culture and the role of the media, you know,
as well as the same general observations about Englishness being subsumed into Britishness, with this point about the iconography often associated with Britain.
It's interesting that, because, like, you know, on the one hand, there is, you know, you can see there always was in some ways, Englishness and Britishness were sort of synonymous, and they were sort of used as a proxy for one another. But I mean, like, it's quite weird, because if you look in Wales and, like, Welsh, even up to in the First World War, you know, Welshmen would refer to themselves as Englishmen, because English was just interchangeable with Britishness in some ways, in some levels. But, and I guess if you look at, you know, you go back to, like, the literary representations of Britishness, you know, sort of in this really just rolling meadows and, like, things like that. And the landscapes and things like that, and chocolate box houses. I mean, those places just don't exist in Wales. You know, those are sort of those are the that's iconography, which is England.
I also wanted to figure out whether there was any particular political or state failure that pushed them away from Britishness and towards their particular independence movements. And, well, let's see. If you're supporting Scottish independence, which you are, you're essentially advocating for a new state, a new nation state to be founded, right? What I wanted to kind of get at with that is, what do you think this nation state that you would construct, or would ideally construct, would do that was so different to the British nation, the British state that exists now? Like, what would be so different about it? Why would it be different? And why is it good that it would be different, you know?
Well, I'll just start with the last one there. Why is it good that it would be different? I think you'd be hard-pressed to find a country of a similar economic level in the sort of Western European region that is worse than the UK. I think you'd be hard-pressed to argue against the fact that there is something abnormal, there's something unique, there's something anomalous about just quite how poisoned this country's infrastructure, government, and the entire foundation of how it's run is. I can't get into that just now, because that's pretty much the entirety of what the left in the UK talks about all the time, right?
Yeah, right.
So that's like everything, right? I'm just pointing it. Yeah,
well, it's interesting, because I've obviously, you know, I had an academic career that I sort of torpedoed by essentially criticising Welsh devolution and saying that it was essentially neoliberalism and the sort of this thin veneer of Welsh Labour sort of progressivism. So, like, I've not really been into this idea that Wales is, like, inherently a more progressive place with a more progressive political culture. Although, I guess if it comes down to it, you could look at like what's happened in devolution and say, all right, there is like a thin veneer of like more progressive sort of politics in Wales. Although I'm not mad about it, but in terms of like policies or what it would look, how it would be different. I mean, obviously you would hope that it would be, essentially not a quasi-fascist state, which is essentially what the UK is rapidly on the way to turning into. I mean, that's like, so, I think on the one, like, you can view it in a purely negative sense. It's just an escape. Mm-hmm. It's just an escape from, what's happening in the UK but not just the UK, across the world. Like, authoritarian neoliberalism is being like rapidly locked in.
We've got 4 million food banks in the United Kingdom. We have a term that is called the working poor. We're in the 21st century, and the term working poor is commonly used in this country. That is how the British state has failed the citizens of the United Kingdom. And that's just 2 examples that I've got loads more if you'd like them. Well, the British state has got to a place where it thinks it's living off its past reputation, is what it's doing. So there was, during the pandemic, it was seemed quite a sort of Churchillian, we'll get through this together attitude, but doing it without actually producing the results. So 37 billion pounds on a track and trace system that didn't work. That's 37 billion pounds. We have a national debt that's just gone over 2 trillion. That is not the a successful state does not get itself into 2 trillion pounds worth of debt. Norway has no national debt. We lost. There was over 150,000 deaths from COVID. Look at New Zealand statistics in comparison. There have been countless number of people who have died homeless on the streets over the past 10 years. Austerity has killed hundreds of thousands of people while making a very small amount of people a lot richer. That, to me, is the definition of a failed state.
It's hard to argue with all those sentiments. It's difficult if you live in the UK to have a sense that better things are possible. In fact, that even came up as well with Elijah saying that good things seemed possible outside the UK rather than within it.
I think when you look at the material makeup of what an independent Scotland would be, which is a country with massive renewable energy potential, a country that has that requires connections to mainland Europe, that requires an international way of operating, that would possibly shift its kind of sort of geopolitical neighbor assumptions, maybe to the north rather than the south. There's so many factors that can very, I think, easily happen in the long term. And to me, these are all good things if they happen. I can't guarantee they will, but I think they're possible and I think they're good. And I can't think of that many. Downsides. Yeah, I mean, I don't know for sure. I can't say for sure, but I see a lot of potentially good possibilities and very negative.
And you think none of these positive possibilities are possible in the UK?
I don't think so. No.
Yeah. Okay. That's pretty much what I needed to hear.
I can go over them again, but I think anyone listening to what I was just talking about would be like, yeah, no, that's not, no.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah. I think that's fair. I didn't just want it to be negative, though. And so while there's a lot to unpack, we will unpack it, trust me. I wanted to see what they thought of as the positives of Britain. And so we got some interesting answers, some that align with things I said earlier in this video.
I like the ideal of what the BBC was meant to be. I like the idea of highbrow, sarcastic comedy shows, dramas written by people who try much harder than they really have to. And maybe that was the case every now and then at some points, but I think I might be over fondly remembering being a child and watching the occasional BBC show. It's an ideal.
Yeah.
It's not real. Like so many things about British identity, it's a veneer of sophistication and a morality that is papering over a whole host of tensions and disruptions. I guess when the UK had a welfare state after the Second World War through the 60s and was able to produce some really good fucking music because of it.
Well, yeah, like I love Oasis, and I hate the fact that that's now like deeply unfashionable, and I deeply resent all the online leftists making fun of Oasis. No, like yeah, like I don't know, like there's loads of things, but I think identity is like banal as well. I mean, like trying to explain to like my girlfriend and like my family, whatever, but like you grow up with these cultural reference points. Like I have like a deep love for a lot of like English football players. Like I've just grown up with them. And I it sounds bizarre, but I feel like I feel like extreme affection for like Wayne Rooney, Gary Neville, Jamie Carragher, Marcus Rashford. All these lads that like I've grown up and they've been like beamed into my living room, and I've identified with since I was a kid. I know that's not like a state identity, but there's just like you could be here all day naming British things and artists and sportsmen that I think are amazing people.
Well, first of all, I don't know what Britishness is. I really don't. Certainly not anymore. There are times when I think the 2012 Olympics would have been a good one. I could feel some sort of Britishness then. There was a national mood. Whenever England do well at the football, everybody does come together. But aside from those sorts of events, I really have no idea what Britishness is.
As I said, you might recognise some of those things as positives yourself or from earlier in the video, and while I think there's a lot to be critical of in some of those examples, especially the way liberals will use things like the 2012 Olympics as a sort of year zero when everything was peaceful and fine, and then it all starts going wrong. It's important to try to understand Britishness as a whole, rather than solely focus on the things that we all obviously dislike. To give a brief summary of Britishness, there is a British self-image that is pervasive and dominant here. One of a tolerant, decent, uncorrupted country that, fought against tyranny and continued to fight against tyranny after that. Which rings false. It rings false to me, and it's rung false for an awful long time. And it leads me to this question. If the self-image of the country and the common understanding of the dominant identity in that country is so wildly different from reality, what can you do about it? Like, what do we do about it? Do we just let it fester as we have done for the best part of 40, 50, 60, how many years? Or should we actually see whether there's anything we can do about it?
The case for abolition.
As I reflect on both the positive and negative that came out of both my own thinking about my experiences of Britishness and my interviewees' thoughts, I was left wondering, what is there really to salvage here? It looks to me like reforming Britain and Britishness is a bit like trying to make a cocktail with arsenic. You're going to poison yourself and anyone you give it to. I would love for this video to end here with a frame like this. But unfortunately, we're going to have to go into a little tiny bit more depth than that. Reflecting specifically on my personal experience, there's one line that stood out to me when I was writing it. And it was, is this a feature or a bug? The things that I highlighted with the gradual mainstreaming of views that were held by fascists and the general insecurity in this country that made me feel, it's a feature. It is. It's a feature of a post-imperial state in decline who can't let go of the fact that the days of Britain looking like this are gone. And it's actually good that it's gone. A legacy of brutalizing people across the world, and the legacy of the fact that the way this country has educated people to do that over centuries is why we're finally experiencing being governed by the British, because the cunts who would go out and do the brutalizing have nowhere to go. And I'm glad we're not sending them out across the world to the colonies to cut people's hands off or to do genocide, though we're still participating in those things thanks to neocolonialism. It turns out being governed by the British is shit. And it's shit because of the fundamentals of the British identity. The feeling I get is, if it's really this embedded both within the identity and the state, surely we should just do literally anything to see it changed up. And if the reform is on such a large scale that it's effectively impossible to do, well, what does that leave us with? I can't probably say it on YouTube, but at the very least the fundamentals that make this up need to be directly challenged. The things that our fantastic interviewees said to me are currently rattling through my head, especially their pessimism on whether better things are in fact possible in the UK as it's currently constituted. They named a series of problems, particularly Dave, who mentioned several deficiencies that would make other developed countries blush. While it's entirely possible for us to say Britain can be this or it could be that, I mean, if I had wheels I'd be a wagon. Look at this country honestly, at the political climate, at the reaction to movements like Black Lives Matter, at the reaction to insulate Britain, even among the left, and boy, would insulating Britain seem like a good idea in the context of rising energy prices. Look at all of those things and tell me honestly, do you think we can get the scale of the change we need with this country the way it is currently? I want to share one more clip with you all from the interviews. I asked Dave whether there was anything that could be done to make him step away from Northern independence, and here's what he said.
Balance. Everything in the universe depends on balance. Anything that's unbalanced will eventually right itself. So the fact that the Northern Independence Party exists demonstrates that there is an imbalance, because if there wasn't, we wouldn't have been created. People don't go against the status quo when it works for them. So an equal and fair country, people wouldn't vote against that, would they? If everybody had equality, if everybody had justice, if everybody had a fair crack at the whip, and everybody was living a nice and happy life, then they wouldn't vote against that.
And the fact that that feels impossible, not just unlikely, but impossible, to me should tell you something. I also wanted to reflect a little more on the self-image the UK has of itself, that is playing a role in this current state of affairs, feeling untenable. You can't keep saying Britain is the least racist country in the world while also banging the drum loudly about how we should send people to Rwanda who dare come here. I don't see how that's a thing you can do. It's creating the kind of dissonance that in other countries would lead to interesting outcomes. Not that I'm advocating that in this video, but seriously, you do wonder how much more there is to take before something gives one way or another. That's not to say there aren't benefits to being in a larger country with a range of identities within it, but those advantages are being made impossible for us to reap the benefits of because of the elephant in the room. England and Englishness, which has just been subsumed and filtered up into Britishness. So long as Britishness is a tool of state power, as Elijah said, particularly over people in our periphery, then we can't really move forward in a way that actually works for us all. The UK feels uniquely poisoned. It's a malicious entity that will never, ever really be able to grapple with its past or go on to have a future worth having, at least if it stays the way it is. So what should we do about it? I mean, we can't do nothing, but I'll have some thoughts about it when I wrap up this video.
Concluding thoughts.
As you might imagine from the content of the video, my overall conclusion is that all British people, especially leftists, should just walk away from any defence of the British state. And part of confusing and weakening the British state, which I think would be good because it would create the kind of pressure that might lead to some kind of reckoning with itself, with its past, and what it actually wants to be in the future. It will involve separatist movements, and they will probably be the most effective way to do this sort of thing. So the English left, in a lot of cases, ought to just grasp the nettle, support Scottish and Welsh independence, and, you know, even Northern independence and Irish reunification. What do we really have to lose from this? The things that we all point to as positives of Britishness are either largely myths or us putting too much values on things we liked as a kid. Let's move on from caring about the institutions of the British state. It's not ever going to be a thing that we can use for good, or even if it was something we could use. You think they just let you press the great big giant solve the problems button they got in Downing Street? I didn't think so. Right, with that out of the way, I want to thank my guests, my interviewees, Dan from Desolation Radio. It's a very interesting podcast. You should go listen to it. Elijah, a friend of mine, regularly used to come on my stream. Very, very, very cool guy. Hope he's doing well. And Dave, who is also the deputy leader of the Northern Independence Party, which I guess means this was technically my first interview with a serious politician. Kind of a shame it's being used for a video like this, but what can you do? It's just how it goes. I also want to thank my proofreaders. That's Mick Wright, very good friend of mine, and my partner who suffers through these scripts and really gave me some good notes because this was not in a good state in the first draft. I also want to thank the people who did my lovely voiceovers. That would be my friend Peebs, who does these lovely streams on twitch.tv where he paints these Warhammer minis. I'm a huge Warhammer nerd, so I just love having it on in the background whenever he's on. David from Praxis Cast, a very, very good podcast. I've been on it. I was on it quite recently. I decided to torture the Praxis Cast lads with a book. I'll leave a link to that episode down below. You should go check it out. And Jamie, who I would normally say is of Praxis Cast, but is in fact actually of Peace at Home, which is our new podcast that we do together, where I burden him and another one of our friends with the curse of knowledge, specifically about Turkey. It's great fun to record. I assume it's great fun to listen to. Well, I know it's great fun to listen to. I also have to edit it, but go check out the podcast. I have a fantastic time doing it. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. If you want to learn a little bit more about a country that, you know, seems like it should be kind of important, go check it out. I also want to thank the patrons. Honestly, thank you all so much. I really appreciate any and all support. It goes a long way. And if you would like to be a patron, the Patreon will be down below. But I have to do the traditional summoning of the patrons. There they are on the wall. And I want to give a special shout out to Dronerith, Mercutio, Nauseum, and Kersley Scheider. Thank you very much in particular. As I said, if you want to get on the wall or get a shout out, check out the Patreon. You get the videos a day early. You get to vote on the video topics. You get access to the Discord if you're at £2.50 or above. Just a whole lot of fun things. You also get to see the scripts early and see some of my early concepts for these scripts. So, you know, it's all very good. So, with that all done, everyone, let's go abolish Britain and have a good day.